Our next panel is going to have a conversation about the cost of stress in the workplace and the benefit of compassion, if you will. So without further ado, Emma.
I'm Emma Seppala. I'm the Associate Director of CCARE. I'll be moderating this panel on compassion in the bottom line, the cost of stress, and the benefit of compassion for organizations. And we have an absolutely fabulous panel here. Really excited to hear their talks. While Firdaus is setting up, I'll introduce Firdaus, Firdaus is at the Stanford School of Medicine, and he was part of a Nobel Prize-winning group for research done on telomeres, stress and telomeres. That prize was awarded to Elizabeth Blackburn at UCSF, and he was a part of that. Firdaus is Associate Professor of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences, and he has a transdisciplinary research program, works on immunology, stress response, and is an absolutely amazing researcher. So the next person on the panel is Elizabeth Dunn, who has been named Rising Star in Academia by the Chronicle of Higher Education. We're so excited to have her here. She's doing some absolutely fascinating work on the relationship of money and happiness. So welcome, Liz. Next on the panel, Adam Grant, who you may have read about recently in the New York Times article for his book that just came out, Give and Take, A Revolutionary Approach to Success. Again, doing groundbreaking work. He has received a number of different, everyone on this panel seems to have been on TV and in news outlets all over the U.S. And next is the wonderful Mandy O'Neill, who did not know she would be presenting today, but there was a last-minute switch as her collaborator, Sigal Barsade, could not be here. And Mandy, thank you so much for stepping up. She'll also be moderating our next panel. Mandy is Assistant Professor of Management in the George Mason University School of Management. She holds a BS in psychology from Maryland and teaches MBA and undergraduate courses in organizational behavior. So we're looking forward to her talk as well. Thank you so much. And I think I forgot to mention that Liz is currently at the University of British Columbia and Adam is at Wharton, where I think he's been nominated most popular professor. All right? That's what I heard. We're going to actually start with Adam Grant because he's slide free. So Adam, if you'd like to start us off, thank you.
Good. Thank you all so much for coming here. I'm really delighted to have the opportunity to share some ideas about compassion with you. I want to talk about a little bit of research data and maybe also a few practices that you might be able to apply in your own organizations to try to bring compassion into the workplace. But the place I want to start, which a couple of you have heard me talk about before, is the fact that most of the organizations I've studied are not just dominated by fear and anxiety, but also by deep-seated paranoia. The fear that other people are out to get you. And one of my dreams is to create organizations that have the opposite of paranoia, which is actually known as pronoia, or the state of being pronoid. And if you're not familiar with this term, you should be. It's defined by my favorite psychologist, Brian Little, as the delusional belief that other people are plotting your well-being. Also known as the irrepressible fear that other people are going around behind your back and saying exceptionally nice things about you.
Put it in slideshow mode.
And I've been really curious for a while about how can we create organizations where people are not afraid that others, especially their leaders and managers, are out to get them, but rather they fear that other people are out to help them, which sounds terrifying. So how do you do that? Well, I want to talk a little bit about a study that Jane Dutton and Brent Rosso and I did at a company that some of you used to be familiar with called the Borders Group. Before the bookstore chain went out of business, actually very early in the company's evolution, they had this idea that they were going to try to create something of an internal united way. And the thought process was the retail industry is really tight in terms of profit margins, can't always afford the kinds of salaries that you would like to pay your employees. And what if there was a way that we could do something about that? Because many, many employees face what Borders called a life-qualifying event. They had a natural disaster destroy their home. They got sick, or they had a close family member who was sick. There was a death in the family. They were injured and they couldn't work. And a group of Borders executives said, what if we could do something about that and express compassion during those really critical times of suffering? So they built this internal united way. They called it the Borders Group Foundation. And a bunch of executives donated seed money to get it started. And then they had a policy that employee donations would be matched by the company. And they made it really easy for employees to give. It was 50 cents or $1 out of your paycheck, every paycheck, and then the company would match all those funds. And then they put together a committee that would actually vet requests so that if you had a life-qualifying event happen, within 24 hours, a grant could be given to you with no strings attached from the company. And this seemed like a really powerful idea. Within a 10-year period, they'd actually given away over $1.8 million to many, many employees in need. And Jane and Brent and I were called by Borders to try to figure out, well, how does this work? And what is the benefit of having a program that allows for the expression of compassion? So we came in and we started gathering data. We did a series of interviews nationally. We also did a cross-sectional survey of employees and managers across the company. And we found something really surprising, which is we tracked how much you had received from the Borders Group Foundation. Had you ever gotten a grant to actually help you out with a life-qualifying event? And also, not only what you received in the past, but what did you expect to get in the future? Did you anticipate receiving support? Did knowing that your company was going to be there for you if you were suffering actually drive you to become more loyal and more committed? And the answers to those questions were resoundingly no and no. There was zero relationship between what you received in the past and what you expected to receive in the future and your loyalty and commitment to Borders. Now, this was surprising to us because we thought, gee, if an organization takes care of its employees, they should respond by becoming more attached. They should appreciate the support that they get. And then we stumbled upon a surprise, which was we'd also tracked the amount of giving that employees had done to the foundation. How much money were they giving from their paychecks? Also, were they volunteering their time to either review grants or try to make sure that the programs happen? And lo and behold, it was actually the employees who were giving, not receiving, who became more committed and attached to Borders. And this was sort of backward to us, right? We thought that commitment should lead you to give. When you already care about your company, of course you're going to contribute to more. But we actually found the opposite relationship. The more you gave, the more attached that you became. Now, traditionally, psychologists have explained this using cognitive dissonance theory to say, well, you know, if you start giving, and then you're like, why did I just part with my money and my time? You have to convince yourself that you actually care about your company and the people in it in order to maintain a sense of consistency and sanity. But we found support, I think, for a much broader story, which was when employees were able to give to the foundation and support their colleagues who were suffering, they actually felt grateful to the company for giving them an outlet for compassion. As one of the Borders employees actually said, I know there are a lot of people around this company who I care about. This is like a family to me, who are suffering. And until this foundation existed, I had no way to help them. I didn't know who was in need because nobody admitted when they were having a life-qualifying event. I didn't know where my time and my donations could be helpful, but because Borders stepped up and created this process, I was able to express compassion. And I feel really grateful and appreciative that my company is willing to allow me to do that. And what I thought was fascinating about this is that there were many Borders employees who had these identities as giving and caring and helpful people, but they were blocked from expressing those identities in a retail environment that didn't allow compassion to come to the surface. And this program really opened that up and enabled them to express it. The second mechanism was a sense of pride. Not just gratitude for being able to be helpful and giving and caring and compassionate, but also feeling like as you gave more of your money and your time, you actually got exposure firsthand to the good that the company was trying to do. And you were able to see, as several of our managers said, that Borders is actually a company with a heart. That it's a company that cares about not just problems in the external world, but supporting its own employees in their time of need. And together, that gratitude for being able to contribute and the pride in being part of a company that supports that was enough to actually increase commitment. So one takeaway from that set of findings is it's actually the opportunity to express compassion, not just receive compassion, that helps to strengthen the bonds between employees and their organizations. And I think this really turns on its head a lot of what I had assumed about compassion going into this research. So how do organizations do this? And what happens when a company like Borders goes under? Well, I'm really proud to report that although Borders is no longer in existence, the Borders Group Foundation still is. There's a group of employees who continue to run that program for anybody who's ever worked for Borders in case they face a life-qualifying event in a future company. And I think it's amazing to see how that program for expressing compassion has actually outlived the company itself. And it shows you how much that program really mattered to its employees. It's not the only example, though, of programs that you could create in an organization that allow for the expression of compassion. One of my other favorites is at a call center company called Appletree Answers. This is a company in Delaware that runs probably one of the worst call centers that you've ever seen. They are the ones who basically staff call centers that no company ever wants to run internally because they have to deal with such miserable customer complaints. So if you want to basically fight those out of your company, you can outsource them to Appletree. As you might expect, Appletree had a turnover rate annually of 97%. If you are lucky, 3 out of every 100 employees decide to stay. And the CEO, John Ratliff, was deeply disturbed by what had happened to his company. They started out actually as a pretty caring and compassionate organization, but they went through about a dozen mergers and acquisitions. They grew very quickly over a 6-year period, and the culture had just gotten eroded. So he gathered a group of people together, and he said, okay, what if we could change the culture? How could we make it more caring and compassionate? And one of the team members had an idea and said, instead of United Way, what if we now take the Make-A-Wish Foundation as a model? Why should wish granting be reserved to children who are facing life-threatening medical conditions? Many, many people in their workplaces are facing suffering. And what if we could do something about it? And there was a little bit of a buzz of excitement in the room. And it turned into a program that Appletree called Dream On. And the idea is that every employee who works at Appletree has the opportunity to make a request, a wish, a dream. And this is the coolest job on earth. There's actually a team of people at the company whose job it is to make the dreams happen. So they work in a committee, and whatever the dream is, they try to support it. They've had over 100 dreams that were posed to this committee, and one of the best ones I thought was a woman who said her husband was facing a very severe illness. He was a huge Philadelphia Eagles fan, and he really wanted to go and see a game, which would lift his spirits. And of course, they were not only able to make that happen, but at the game, the entire Eagles team came and met him. They gave him jerseys. They signed a number of pieces of memorabilia. And he walked away from that experience with, I think, a renewed sense of hope and energy that carried him through the rest of his treatment plan. There was another case where a father who worked at Appletree Answers wanted to throw a birthday party for his daughter, and he wanted to do it at a circus. And he didn't have the means or really the understanding to make it happen. And again, the Dream Granting Committee was able to step up. They organized not only a circus birthday party, but also a backstage meet and greet for the daughter to meet all of the animals and the performers. And it was really a life-changing experience for that family. Now, what I think is most interesting that's happened as a result of that Dream On program is the turnover rate has dropped from 97% to 33% within 6 months of introducing that program. And if you ask John Ratliff, one of the things he'll say is, look, this has actually changed the everyday culture of compassion that exists in this organization. Because all of a sudden, we have people who used to basically work in task mode on their headsets answering calls all day. And now they've actually started opening up and becoming human. When you see your coworkers make these kinds of requests, when you see them say, look, this is my biggest dream in life that I cannot get on my own, then it's really hard not to engage with them as human beings who have real feelings and who you might actually really care about. And I think what it's done is it's allowed a lot of employees to express more compassion on an everyday basis once they see each other much more in these human terms. And I think it's another really powerful example of an organization expressing compassion. Again, as you might expect, it's a lot of the dream granters, not just the employees who are getting their wishes granted, who have the opportunity now to feel more connected to that sense of community that's created when they have a chance to help out their colleagues who are in need or facing a request that they just can't fulfill on their own. So what do you do if you don't work in an organization like Borders or like Appletree, where there's not support from the very top for a program like this? Well, I think there's a wonderful answer that was created by Wayne Baker at the University of Michigan, as well as Cheryl Baker at Humax Networks. It's called the reciprocity ring. If you've not been part of one of these exercises before, I recommend it to every person in this room. It's often eye-opening and meaningful, and in some cases, even life-changing. All you do, you can do this in any organization, is bring together a group of people, 10, 20, maybe 30, and ask everyone to think of a request or a dream that they would actually like to have granted. But it has to be something that's deeply meaningful to them and can't be succeeded or achieved on their own. Then the rest of the group tries to use their knowledge and their networks to make it happen. And it's a great opportunity for people to express compassion in situations where they don't normally know what their colleagues actually need. It's also a nice opportunity to bring together the capabilities and networks and connections of a group to try to fulfill these requests that otherwise would be impossible to fulfill. I'll just throw out one favorite example, maybe two if we have time. A couple years ago, I've run this in my class for a while, and I had a student named Michelle who stood up, and she said, She had a friend whose growth was stunted due to a childhood illness. And she had to shop as an adult in the children's clothing section. And she never felt like she really fit in. And Michelle really wanted to help her. But she didn't know how. One of the other students, Jessica, raised her hand and she said, I actually have an uncle who works in the garment industry and I'm happy to reach out and see if we can make something happen. And 3 months later, Michelle's friend Hope had custom designed clothes arrive on her doorstep. And for the first time in her adult life, she actually had clothes that fit and made her look like an adult as opposed to a child. I think that after that happened, the culture of my classroom completely changed. And all of a sudden, students who previously saw each other as competition for jobs actually looked at each other as people with real needs and went out of their way to help each other. My all-time favorite request came from a student named Alex. Alex was going through treatment, he was going through chemotherapy at the time, and a lot of the students in the classroom didn't know how to engage with him. They were just really uncomfortable and didn't know what was the appropriate course of action. And when we started this reciprocity ring, Alex stood up and asked for help. And he said, look, I haven't had a lot of time to go through recruiting. My dream is to run a company like Six Flags one day because I think riding roller coasters is the closest thing to nirvana in life. And as I've been going through this terrible illness, I've been in a situation where going to an amusement park has really lifted my spirits. But I don't know necessarily how to get access because Six Flags doesn't normally recruit at the Wharton School of Business. And he asked if anyone could help him, and another student, Andrew, stood up and said, yeah, my dad actually knows the former CEO of Six Flags, I'll get you in touch. So 2 weeks later, Alex connects with the ex-CEO by cell phone. They have a really enlightening conversation. Alex comes to class the next day. I'm so excited. And I'm like, Alex, tell me about your conversation. And he said, well, it was an hour. I learned a ton to the point where I now know I never, ever want to work in that industry. And I said, great, at least you've ruled that out, and now you can go on to pursue other dreams. And I'm proud to report that today, Alex is happily employed as a management consultant. So if there's one thing that you take away from these stories, it's the idea that when organizations create mechanisms for expressing compassion, it doesn't just benefit the people who receive compassion, it also benefits the people who have a chance to participate in the giving and helping and contributing process. And I think we need to create more mechanisms that allow people to express those tendencies. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Adam. Firdaus' slides are now up.
I'm a member on the faculty here in the Department of Psychiatry, as well as the Institute for Immunity, Transplantation, and Infection at Stanford. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about our work on stress and how it might fit into the context of the kinds of things that Jim, Emma, and colleagues and I have been talking about over the past several years. All right, 9:06. So here is a poster from the National Library of Medicine that says stress is a loaded gun. If left untreated, stress can kill you just as surely as a bullet. It also says, don't wait for the gun to go off, get help today. And I want to request you to consider two things with me as you look at this poster. One is that while this situation can indeed be true, it need not always or necessarily be the case that stress is this big, bad, pathological entity. Okay, the other is that while a loaded gun can kill you, just as this poster says, a loaded gun can also protect you if you're holding it and if you know how to use it. And I know that these are politically charged times, and Jim's like thinking, what the hell is he doing here? So I want to make a very important disclaimer. Strict conflict of interest rules here at Stanford. Our work is not supported by the National Rifle Association. This is just a poster from National Library of Medicine making the point about stress. Okay, so we define stress as a constellation of events that begins with a stimulus, the stressor, that precipitates a reaction in the brain, this is your stress perception, that then results in the activation of fight or flight systems in the body. And it's extremely important to understand that without this biological stress response, it really doesn't matter what's going on outside the organism or even inside one's head. You need that biological stress response to have an impact on the organism, the person, or the body, and that's what we study. So everybody would agree that if a prototypical danger stimulus, such as a cheetah or a lion, walked into this room, we would pretty much all mount a stress response and start figuring out, well, how do we escape? And hopefully many of us here would also try to help others escape and get out of danger, right? So here is your biological stress response: increased heart rate, increased adrenaline, noradrenaline, cortisol, and cytokines, which we won't specifically talk about today. But something like I'm doing right now, especially being prepped by the computer not working, and see the graphics dropping out, which is why I wanted to use my own computer. This, by the way, is the CCARE logo here. just this exactly what's here, also induces a similar biological stress response. Voluntarily exercising, which many of us are happy to do, many of us don't consider that as being stressful, yet the biological response stimulated under these conditions is virtually identical to that stimulated by the presence of a lion. And finally, intensely excitatory and pleasurable stimuli, such as approaching someone for a first kiss, especially if the person doing the approaching is romantically challenged, will also launch the same kind of biological stress response. And in fact, sexual intercourse is one of the most potent drivers of this response. So what's going on? The central hypothesis that we started to work under was that just as the stress response prepares the cardiovascular, the musculoskeletal, and the neuroendocrine systems for fight or flight, under certain conditions, it may also prepare the immune system for challenges such as wounding or infection that may be imposed by the stressor. In other words, short-term stressors will enhance immune function in compartments like the skin that are likely to be compromised by the actions of a stressor. So that could be a predator, such as a lion in nature, or it could be the process of undergoing surgery in a modern medical context. Okay? So most research is understandably focused on long-term chronic or bad stress. And these stressors are very important to study, and I'll conclude this talk by talking about some of the effects of these stressors. But what we felt is also important is to investigate and harness the protective effects of Mother Nature's fight or flight stress response. And so these are short-term stress responses where stress-reactive biological factors increase rapidly under challenge conditions and then rapidly go down to resting conditions. And these generally tend to be your good protective stress responses, whereas this long exposure to chronic exposure to stress-related factors tends to be harmful. So how do we study these stressors? So in the laboratory, we look at the Trier social stress test. This is a standardized psychosocial lab stressor. The subjects come into the lab. They are asked to make a speech in front of an audience that's not as kind and friendly as you guys are. So the audience is trained to be non-reactive, non-positive feedback-giving audience. And they're also asked to do math in public. And this stresses people out. Okay. The other example that I'll show you today is the process, the acute stress of undergoing surgery. And we quantify these stress responses by measuring changes in hormones, changes in physiology, changes in psychological states, and behavior. So one of the first questions we asked is, how does the immune system react during short-term stress? And what you're going to see is a very important reaction profile. Okay, so what I'm showing you here is changes in cytolytic T cells. This is one of your major protective immune cells in the body. You're looking at these cells changing in the bloodstream over time. The time involves a baseline sample taken at the patient's home 7 to 10 days before surgery, and then it involves changes during the acute stress of undergoing surgery. And you see this prototypical profile. Initially, there's a rapid and significant increase in immune cell numbers at the beginning of stress. Then immune cell numbers decrease. This is all happening in the blood. And then they recover back to baseline. So what exactly is going on? What does this up-down profile induced by acute stress in the bloodstream during stress signify? And so I'm going to summarize about 15 to 20 years worth of work in this next slide. What we believe is happening is that immune cells, which are the body's soldiers, are initially leaving their barracks, which is the organs like the spleen, the bone marrow, and the marginated pool, and entering the boulevards of the body, which is the bloodstream. So immune cell numbers in the barracks go down, and immune cell numbers in the boulevards or the blood vessels go up, and that is what you register or quantify as an increase in immune cells in the blood during about the first 20 minutes of the beginning of a stress response. As the stress response proceeds, you now begin to see a decrease in blood numbers of immune cells, and this decrease does not represent a net loss of immune cells or a net loss of the body's soldiers, but it represents a redistribution. So the cells have now left the blood, they register as a decrease in numbers, and now they're going on to potential battlefields in the body, of which the skin and the skin-draining lymph nodes are major ones, but there are other targets to which these cells also go. So what the acute stressor does is it increases the number of defenders at potential battle stations in the body. And it also increases their firepower, so that if the stressor is then followed by the bite of a lion or the cut of a surgeon's scalpel, then there are more troops ready to respond at the site of wounding or surgery. So short-term stress then activates the body's defenses even before there is wounding or activation. And people used to ask me, well, how do the cells know where the lion's going to bite you or where the surgeon's going to make the incision? And the point is that the cells do not know where this is going to happen. They essentially traffic to all potential battle stations under these conditions. If nothing further happens, everything goes back to normal within about 3 to 4 hours after the cessation of stress. So then the question we asked is, does a short-term stress response experienced during surgery, vaccination, or cancer progression enhance immune function? And we've done many, many studies from different angles to address this, and the answer is yes. If you couple a short-term stressor with the process of undergoing surgery, and that short-term stressor is an adaptive one that is naturally mounted by the patient undergoing surgery, they recover better. If you couple a short-term stressor with a vaccination-type immune response, the folks who mount the adaptive stress response during vaccination actually show a better response compared to folks who don't. And we're just beginning to see that pulsing the system, pulsing a tumor system with hits of this acute fight-or-flight stress response, activation of its physiology, can enhance anti-tumor immunity. And we want to figure out how to harness this. So let me give you one quick clinical example of the good stress, then we talk about bad stress, and then we try to put it together in the context of what we're all interested in today. So here is an example of our surgery study again. This is acute stress, is the process of undergoing knee surgery. Samples taken at the patient's home at baseline, 7 to 10 days before surgery. Then on the day of surgery, just before surgery, we take a sample. Just after surgery, we take a blood sample. These are all small blood samples. And then we measure recovery using the Lysholm scale, which is the gold standard of measuring recovery outcomes for this type of knee surgery. And what we want to see is whether patients who show this adaptive, up-down redistribution profiles of immune cells in the blood during surgery, we want to see whether these patients recover better compared to patients who kind of fail to show that adaptive profile during surgery. And again, we've looked at these profiles from many different angles, but I'm just showing you the leukocyte redistribution profile as one example for today's talk. So we're kind of beginning to put together a picture of what these adaptive protective profiles look like. So here's some actual data. On the y-axis, you're looking at knee function measured by the Lysholm scale, again, which is the gold standard of recovery. And on the x-axis, you're looking at time. And every few weeks, for a year on out after surgery, we measured the patient's return to recovery. And interestingly, you see that folks who mounted this adaptive redistribution profile of immune cells during the stress of surgery show earlier recovery, these black closed squares, and they show a significantly higher maximal recovery. Again, it's the closed black squares compared to patients who showed a maladaptive or flatline response during surgery. So tactically harnessing your troops during the call to arms that occurs biologically during the process of undergoing surgery has a significant advantage. These folks who showed the maladaptive profile never reached the maximum recovery levels of the folks who did not. And I'm very happy to report that together with Jim, we will be looking at these kinds of recovery profiles with these kinds of stress measures in the context of the kinds of surgeries that Jim does. And so one of our goals is to maximally harness the protective biology of short-term stress during surgery, vaccination, and cancer therapy. So what about bad stress? Okay. How do we reconcile the immunoenhancement findings with the well-known stress-induced suppression or dysregulation of immune function? How does an adaptive response become maladaptive? And the answer lies again in the transition from these acute punctate fight-or-flight responses to chronic long-term area under the curve exposure to biological stress-related factors. Now, chronic stress is bad, and as the speakers so far have alluded to, there are significant costs to having chronic stress as an individual, as an organization, as well as perhaps a society. And I'm just going to list some of these bad effects of chronic stress that we know. So chronic stress suppresses protective immune responses. The kind of immunity you want is suppressed during chronic stress. It accelerates biological aging. Emma mentioned some of that when she introduced me. It increases susceptibility to infection, some types of cancer, cardiovascular disease, and so on. So biologically, bad news. It also increases factors like depression, anxiety, fear that Jim mentioned, as well as induces a lack of motivation. This would altogether induce an increase in healthcare expenses, which we do not want, increase the cost of sick leave from the perspective of an organization, increase irritability and aggressive tendencies, which again, from an interaction point, is not a good thing to happen. Together, increase time lost from work, increase employee turnover, maybe contributing to some of the things that Adam mentioned, and then overall induce a decrease in efficiency, productivity, and creativity. So therefore, there are likely to be tremendous benefits of minimizing bad stress responses and optimizing good stress responses. I'm cognizant of what you're showing, so I will finish up. Okay? So we have proposed the idea of a stress spectrum, where one end of the stress spectrum shows you the good fight or flight punctate stressors. These are the stressors the way Mother Nature intended us to use them. And Mother Nature gave us these stress responses to protect us. But unfortunately, for many reasons, some of them under our control and many of them not, these stress responses can turn into bad stress, which again involves long-term chronic exposure to these stress-reactive biological factors. In the middle of the spectrum, you have your low stress or no stress resting zone. Now, what you want for good health appears to be the following. Minimize that bad stress or chronic stress. Maximize your green zone, so maximize your resting zone, but don't be afraid of times when you're called upon to be stressed and mount those fight or flight stress responses, because you may actually need them not only to protect you during surgery, but also to give your optimal performance. And many athletes, performers, and others will tell you that, yeah, actually I need that little sort of adrenaline type response to do well. Well, how do you get there? Sleep, nutrition, and exercise appear to be major factors by which you can sort of enable yourself to get there. But there are positive interventions that one could also apply, and they could be meditation, yoga, dance, exercise, art, music, fishing. Jim uses neurosurgery for this, he says, and compassion. Okay, both. Like Adam said, giving as well as receiving compassion may be a path to sort of getting towards this healthy end of the stress spectrum. Studies have shown that practicing compassion meditation, my colleague Tad Pace at Emory and Chuck Raison have shown, decreases stress-related, the bad stress-related factors in individuals. And studies have also shown that receiving compassion, a patient receiving compassion from its health caregiver, from his or her health caregiver, increases recovery from ailments like the common cold. And there could be other aspects of this. So the benefits of reducing chronic stress could not only help the individual, but could also help those around them and ripple on to society as a whole. And in many of the conversations on compassion that we've had, Jim has mentioned this ripple effect. So I just wanted to use this last slide to sort of give you some ideas about how that might work. Okay? So chronic stress. If you reduce chronic stress at the level of the individual, what you're likely to do is decrease their tendencies to be aggressive, irritable, decrease their susceptibility to illnesses, and decrease their depressive symptoms, and in some cases, the onset of frank clinical depression. What this would also do is perhaps increase performance, productivity, creativity, and their ability perhaps to give as well as receive compassion. This would then translate in a bidirectional way to a decrease in chronic stress in the immediate circle of the individual. So I myself have been thinking about this a lot. When I'm chronically stressed, I feel that my threshold to get irritable with my kids, sometimes unfortunately with my spouse, becomes lower. And I try to remind myself that, hey, wait a minute, you know what? This is not such a good thing. So really effectively and genuinely thinking about this and decreasing these chronic stress levels can help one in their immediate circle. You know, my lab, my coworkers feel better and do better because my irritability, if it's my chronic stress that's being reduced, would be lower, and that would transcend over to them and have effects the same way. So these result in positive ripple effects that could then move on to reducing stress and enabling these positive factors in larger groups. So the end result, what you would end up doing, hopefully, is to maximize good stress and resting zone states, increase health and well-being, increase performance, efficiency, productivity, creativity, and hopefully increase pro-social behavior, compassion, and peace, as Jim, I'm sure, will mention in his concluding talk. And again, many times, Jim and speakers have mentioned this ripple effect, an inflection point at which point these positive factors start to spread in society, hopefully the way Facebook and Twitter and all those other guys have spread. So our goals are to maximally harness the biology of good stress in a clinical, individual, and societal setting, and to reduce or eliminate bad stress to maximize this zone of health and healing. And a big thank you to many, many folks along the way who have made it possible for us to do these studies. And thank you all for listening.
Thank you. First off, it's just such a treat to get to be here and be part of this panel and talk to all of you, so thank you. All right, now I think most of us, and certainly most of us here in this room, appreciate the value of compassion, of reaching out to help others. But when we start talking about the bottom line, about money, it's easy to kind of lose sight of compassion. In fact, research suggests that just thinking about money makes us less interested in the needs of others. Now, personally, this idea really came to life for me when CNN.com ran a story covering some of my research on money and happiness. The story was entitled, "Winning the Lottery, Does It Guarantee Happiness?" And readers responded by spontaneously generating their own plans for what they would do if they won the lottery. So, for example, one person wrote, If I won the lottery, I would take it upon myself to try and teach people the value of money. For example, I would walk up to people on the street and hold out a couple $100 and say, here, you want this? When they reached for it, I would yank it back and be like, yeah, right, what are you, crazy? Do you think people just wake up and get handed huge sums of money? Of course, I wouldn't tell them that I won the lottery because that kind of defeats the lesson I'm trying to convey. These were real. I'm amazed. Anyway, okay. Next, another one wrote, I would fill a big bathtub with money and get in the tub while smoking a big fat cigar and sipping a glass of champagne. Then I'd have a picture taken and dozens of 8x10 glossies made. Anyone begging for money or trying to extort from me would receive a copy of the picture and nothing else. All right, so money can push us away from really wanting to help others. But in today's talk, I want to suggest that helping others might actually be the best way to buy happiness with our money. In one of the first experiments that my collaborators and I conducted on this topic, we went out on our beautiful campus at the University of British Columbia and basically made people into miniature lottery winners. We just walked up to people and handed them a $5 or $20 bill, which we asked them to spend by the end of the day. There was a little twist, though. We told half the people to spend the money on themselves, and we told half to spend it on somebody else. Now, when these people were given this bit of extra cash, mostly students, what did they do? Well, people told to spend it on themselves did things like buying earrings, eyeshadow, as well as lots of food and drinks for themselves. In contrast, when people were told to spend the money on others, what we call pro-social spending, they did things like buying toys for younger siblings, making donations to charity, as well as buying food or drink for friends. Now, at the end of the day, compared to people who'd spent the money on themselves, those who'd spent the money on others were significantly happier. Of course, we conducted this study in Vancouver, which is a relatively affluent city, so we wondered whether we would detect the same kind of effect in less wealthy parts of the world. We've now followed up on that early experiment and conducted similar studies in a range of different parts of the world, from Uganda to South Africa to India. And what we see is that even in poor areas of the world where people are struggling to meet their own basic needs, people seem to get real emotional benefits from using their money to benefit other people. Now, the fact that we see this phenomenon emerge in cultures around the world suggests it might just be a fundamental component of human nature. If that's the case, it's possible that we could detect it even among very young children. So to examine this idea, we teamed up with developmental psychologist Kylie Hamlin and studied children just under the age of 2. Now, of course, your typical toddler isn't that interested in money, so we basically used the toddler equivalent of gold, namely goldfish crackers. So I'm going to show you a brief video clip of one of the actual participants in our study. And as you'll see, she both receives a big windfall of goldfish for herself and also gets the chance to give some of them away. Okay, let's see if this works. Ooh, sound? There we go.
Can I have Monkey back? Or we're going to play a game. Look, Monkey has a bowl just like you. Yeah. But both you and Monkey don't have any treats. Oh, no. You don't have any treats, and neither does Monkey. That's right.
Maybe I'll just pause for a second and see if you can get the sound.
Try that.
All right, well, that's okay. I'll just narrate it. You're going to miss the toddler making like adorable sounds that I just will not attempt to mimic, but let's see what's happening here. Okay, so the toddler and the monkey are both getting bowls that are empty. Now, the experimenter here is about to discover some treats, some goldfish. You can watch what happens with the toddler. She would be bursting out now saying, treats! But if you're missing that, oh well. Now, the toddler is going to get invited to share some of her treats with the monkey. All right, so as you can see, this toddler was pretty happy when she got a bowl full of goldfish for herself, but she looked even happier when she got to give the treats away. Now, when we have research assistants code these toddlers' facial expressions throughout these videos, what we see is that toddlers consistently exhibit the greatest happiness when they get to give the treats away to this charming monkey puppet. Now, these toddlers might seem like a far cry from your own, say, coworkers, but I would argue that if this warm glow of giving is a fundamental component of human nature, we really ought to be able to harness it in organizations. So to examine this idea, we worked with a large bank in Australia. Now, of course, businesses often make large donations to charity, but what this bank did was rather than making one big donation to charity, they provided their employees with the opportunity to make donations, individual donations, on the bank's behalf. To do this, they gave their employees vouchers to a website called Karma Currency. If you have a voucher to Karma Currency, you can go to this website, log in, and make a donation to the charity of your choice. Now, we measured employees' job satisfaction both before and after these vouchers were distributed to a randomly selected subset of employees. We found that employees who got $100 Australian to donate to charity on their company's behalf exhibited a significant increase in job satisfaction. Now, interestingly, a voucher for a smaller amount did not do the trick, and I'd be happy to talk about why that might be in the question and answer, but I think this experiment provides us with some initial evidence that pro-social spending might actually enhance job satisfaction. Of course, today we're talking about the bottom line, so going beyond job satisfaction, we wondered whether pro-social spending might also improve job performance, particularly in the context of teams. To get at this idea, we looked at 14 pharmaceutical sales teams in Belgium. Each team consisted of 9 or 10 members, and we gave several members on each team 15 euros to spend. On some teams, we told everyone to spend the money on themselves. On other teams, we said, okay, we want you to spend this money on one of your teammates. Meanwhile, we conducted a parallel experiment looking at a very different type of team, namely dodgeball teams in Canada. We looked at 11 dodgeball teams and gave members of these teams $20 Canadian to spend either on themselves or a teammate. Now, across these very different types of teams, we found that pro-social spending improved team performance. That is, when people had the opportunity to spend money on their teammates, pharmaceutical sales teams sold more drugs, and dodgeball teams won more games. Now, I want to be really clear, we should be very cautious, I think, in interpreting these findings. This is a small study, small number of teams, and we're actually quite keen to replicate and extend this work, and I'd be thrilled to talk to anybody who would be interested in working with us on that. But I think for now, this provides at least kind of a tantalizing morsel of evidence that perhaps pro-social spending can provide a novel route through which we might improve job performance. To be clear, though, I really don't think that the benefits of pro-social spending are automatic or inevitable. And if we're going to apply these ideas in organizations, we need to think really carefully about how to structure opportunities for pro-social spending. My own employer, UBC, provides members of the organization with the opportunity to donate to UNICEF, for example. Ironically, though, in research that my collaborators and I, including Adam Grant, have conducted, we actually find that as great as I think UNICEF is, people don't seem to get any emotional boost whatsoever from donating to UNICEF. In that very same research, though, we find that people do get a significant emotional boost from donating to an organization called Spread the Net. Now, Spread the Net and UNICEF are actually affiliated organizations that share the common mission of promoting children's health around the world. So why do people feel great when they donate to Spread the Net, but kind of nothing seems to happen when they donate to UNICEF? Well, UNICEF is a very big, broad organization, and I think it can be a little hard to know what kind of difference our dollars are actually making. In contrast, Spread the Net offers donors a very clear, simple, concrete promise. For every $10 donated, they will purchase a bed net to protect a child from malaria. So I think this research points to the critical importance of impact. That is, we're most likely to experience the emotional benefits of giving to others when we can see how our generosity is really making a difference. Meanwhile, other research that I've conducted points to the importance of connection. We're most likely to feel good about giving when we have a real meaningful sense of connection with the beneficiary or the broader cause. And finally, as in so many things, choice matters. We're most likely to reap the emotional benefits of giving when we feel that we have some degree of choice about whether and how to give. I think by taking these three critical ingredients, impact, connection, and choice, into account, we can maximize the benefits of pro-social spending for both individuals and organizations, and maybe help bring compassion back into discussions of the bottom line. Now, I've only touched on these ideas really quite briefly in today's talk, but if you are interested in these ideas, my collaborator, Mike Norton at Harvard, and I have a book coming out on this work entitled Happy Money in a couple of weeks. And I also just want to be sure to acknowledge my other collaborators from around the world who've really played an integral role in the research that I've highlighted today. Thank you.
So hello, everyone. I am not Sigal Barsade. You can think of me as her understudy, but actually I'm her longtime collaborator. Back to the time when I was a PhD student here at Stanford, actually in the Graduate School of Business. So there are lots of pockets of compassion and wonderful research going on. There's some on the other side of the campus, which is large and sprawling and beautiful. I actually see some of the Stanford Business School professors here, including from the Department of Finance. So our work on compassion is spreading to areas we never thought. So it's wonderful you're back, and I'm going to talk today about the bottom line in a very deep setting. So I'm going to provide a little bit more of the, you know who you are, finance professors. I'm going to provide a very deep, almost anthropological look at one organizational setting where compassion, and we're actually going to expand it beyond just compassion, is of utmost importance, not just for the recipients of the compassion, for whom many people in the room are probably familiar, that is, patients in healthcare settings, but actually for the employees themselves, and even beyond that, for the families of patients. So what we're going to suggest over the course of our research is that compassion, and what we're actually going to refer to as companionate love, extends beyond just the immediate beneficiaries that many of the panelists have talked today, but actually to employees and to families, both of employees and, in this case, patients. Now, because we're all in the room, it may come as a surprise to you that much of this research on emotions, and in particular on compassion, is somewhat new for our field, particularly in the field of management and business more broadly. It's actually only been in about the past 25 years that we've had what's been called by some, including Sigal Barsade, as the affective revolution, which is a revolution within organizational behavior and management that acknowledges the importance of feelings and emotions in organizations, not just in terms of some of the things we've talked about today, but individual decision-making, demography, turnover, both classic dependent variables, but also things that we don't think about but influence employees individually and in teams. So this has only been about the past 25 years that we started talking about it. But interestingly, if you go back in time a little bit, what you'll find is that some of the grandmothers, in this case, and grandfathers in management have actually been talking about emotions in a very deep and rich way since, from my own research, about 1911 is the earliest I found, of actual anthropological in-depth studies of organizations, factories we're talking about the importance of being compassionate, affectionate, and tender toward workers, and the importance of this for their productivity. Now, again, this should come as somewhat of a surprise because many of you in the room, at some point in your training, on TV, on the web, wherever, have heard of our old friend Frederick Taylor, the origin of the scientific management revolution. Well, unbeknownst to many of us is the fact that along with some of the robotic emphasis on efficiency is actually a great deal of research on the importance of sympathy and tenderness and kindness toward workers in his own writings. Now, the curious part and the mystery that I'm going to talk about a little bit today is, where did that go? If we were writing about this as early as 1911, 1925 in this quote, what happened in the 50, 75 years in between that we're only now starting to talk about it again today? And one of the reasons that we're going to talk about today is that that mystery fell by the wayside because we started focusing on other things. Some of it might be the bottom line, but some of it is things that are equally important that many of you talk about and probably roll out in your annual employee surveys of job satisfaction. So we spend an enormous amount of time focusing on job satisfaction, kind of left by the wayside some of the other emotions that early management theorists were talking about as well. I'm going to expand out a little bit beyond compassion to talk about what is well known in the psychological world as companion love. Now, one of the things I need to get out there right away is that when we talk about love in the workplace, initially some of you, and we've dealt with this for many years when we present our work, and practitioners and business leaders come up and say, oh, no, we can't talk about love in the workplace. That's an invitation to sexual harassment, all sorts of inappropriate things. We can't talk about love. But actually, the way psychologists have talked about love is very different than the lust and passion that we associate with the word, but actually has much more to do with what we're talking about today, which is compassion, tenderness, and affection for those with whom our lives are intimately intertwined. Now, again, all of you in the room, it's probably preaching to the choir to say that this is important, but you may not believe me when I say that when we present this work, one of the most common objections we get is, no way, this is the workplace. Relationships are not that deep, so that love doesn't actually exist here. I don't believe that love exists in the workplace. I don't think workplace relationships are deep enough. Now, interestingly, if you actually look at the data, we spend the majority of our time at work. I think that some of our panelists would like to believe we spent more of it on sleep and exercise and nutrition, but actually, data for the Bureau of Labor Statistics shows we spend an enormous amount of time at work. So if we're spending 60, 80 hours a week with these people, ideally, we could develop relationships that would come very close to what we're talking about here as companionate love. So what we're going to present today is some evidence that challenges some of these assumptions that love can't exist at work. And organizational cultures cannot be defined by an emotion that we are calling companionate love. We want to provide with you some evidence, sort of a very quantitative, hard-nosed scientific study to show that, in fact, love does exist at work, and it's very important for the bottom line defined across multiple types of constituencies. Now, interestingly, academics might be slow to catch the wave, but many of the business leaders in the room are some of the forefront and pioneers of this, and many organizations that you've heard of, and many more that are not on this board, some of whom we've heard from, some of whom we'll hear from later today, are actually starting to incorporate these principles in their mission statements and in their value statements. So you see increasingly companies explicitly saying, caring for our employees or for our customers is our first principle, our key value. We watch out for each other, we care for each other. Now, interestingly, it's not surprising that organizations are on the forefront of many things. What is surprising is the way they're talking about it. Now, to return back to psychology for a moment, in psychology, we've been talking about companionate love for many, many years. Companionate love is an other-oriented emotion. So it's a perfect emotion in some ways to study from the perspective of culture because it necessarily implies a feeling that exists in relationship to other people. We want to extend it beyond a little bit where we've gone with it to say that it actually relates to another concept that you're surely familiar with and probably ask about in your employee surveys and talk about in strategic meetings, which is organizational culture. Organizational culture has a long history as well, about 25 years of some absolutely fabulous books, many of whom were done here at Stanford in the Graduate School of Business and at other places, MIT. A lot of people in the room have worked with and have done some of the seminal research. What they have found is that organizational culture, not surprisingly, matters for demography, turnover, performance, commitment, everything that we want, right? Well, once again, something was left by the wayside here. What was specifically left by the wayside is what we're calling the emotional culture. And I want you to pause for just a moment to think about your own organizations. And academics, this includes you, think about your own departments, and think about how you would describe the emotional culture of that department. So put aside for a moment the mission statements, put aside what the investor relations departments, say and what we're working on and what we're aspiring toward, but actually think about the emotions that you see being expressed every day at work among colleagues. And it's going to vary a lot, especially, multinational corporations with 55,000 employees. You might be already thinking about which country am I talking about? Which division? Are we talking about the engineers? Are we talking about the marketing people? Each of them, we believe, has a culture. But what we don't know a lot about is the emotional culture. That piece has been left out. What we're going to focus on and what we've been focusing on for about 10 years now is cultures that create what we call an emotional culture of companionate love. Now, this differs from how we're talking about culture in two important ways. One is we're talking about the content. So we're not talking about being team-oriented, we're not talking about being detail-oriented or performance-oriented. We're actually talking about the extent to which you're expressing affection, tenderness, caring, and compassion in your organizations. Another way it differs is the actual way it's transmitted. And throughout the course of the day, you're going to see more work from some of our more neurologically or biologically oriented colleagues on how emotion is transmitted. One of the things that's so unique about it is it's primarily transmitted non-verbally. It's automatic, it's non-conscious in many cases. We pick up on others' emotions without even knowing we're reading them, without even knowing we're noticing them. It's passed through mechanisms like emotion contagion, which is where we catch the emotion of other people. It's passed by simply expressing a smile on our own face, which shows a corresponding change in our own feelings. These nonverbal mechanisms are key to what we talk about when we say the emotional culture. They're also very tricky to measure. So what we're going to show you is that sometimes it takes outside trained raters coming into your organization to talk about and observe emotional culture in addition to your own employees. And that's some of the most interesting. It's always great fun for us to come into other people's organizations and start to do these diagnoses. We focus today for a scientific study of variation organizational culture on the long-term care setting. This setting is important for many, many reasons, one of which is you actually see enormous variation in the emotional cultures of organizational units here. People who write in this setting, and some of you may actually be in this industry, know that healthcare settings have been referred to as ecologies of emotion. Emotions are so critical, they're actually inseparable from interdependent human reactions from caretaking. It's hard for people to actually articulate what an organization in this industry would be like without this. Now again, people can talk about this a lot, but when you get a bit deeper in terms of what employees are actually expressing toward one another, sometimes this is where the variation comes out. It's also important because this industry, more than others, has some of the highest turnover rates of any industry we've ever studied, as high as 110% turnover. Which is very, very difficult for some of these organizations. Also some of the highest levels of dissatisfaction and depression. So this is not what we want for our employees. So we have a very big and important problem to fix, not to mention these are the people that are actually saving lives. I mean, many of us in this room are saving lives through giving jobs, through caring for our workers, through caring for each other. But actually, you know, a lot of our higher science folks are actually literally saving lives here. So some of the dependent variables we're going to talk about are actually trips to the emergency room, things that not only cost money, but actually save lives in a literal sense. What we looked at was a large not-for-profit healthcare facility in a northeastern city that was beneficial to us because it had multiple units and multiple sites. So anybody who's been in the Northeast knows that, you know, it's a little tiny area, but there's a whole lot of variation. So we were able to see a lot of variation in terms of the cultures of these organizations. The important thing for our purposes is that we asked about emotional culture from multiple perspectives. We didn't just ask employees. One of the things that's so interesting about employees is they're kind of fish in water. So sometimes they can't necessarily speak about their culture without seeing others. So we actually asked multiple constituents. We had trained outside raters, and I'll talk about them for a moment, go in and diagnose the culture every time they went into a unit more than 20 minutes, which is fascinating. We also asked employees, and we also asked families of patients, because these are part of this ecology of compassion and love too, that we wanted to see what's their perspective on culture, and does it correspond to what others are saying, and ultimately does it matter? An important factor about our design is we actually looked at this longitudinally, because one of the things that's tricky about culture is people say, well, how can you get at causality? What's causing what? Maybe performance causes good cultures, in which case, you know, maybe we just need to make tons of money and then we can be more compassionate. We actually separated it out in time so that all the variables we measured on the culture side were at time 1, time 2 was measured 16 months later. We asked our trained raters who knew these units very, very well. These were our actual, you know, organizational anthropologists. They blended seamlessly. They knew all the people involved. They knew what was going on. They spent a lot of time on these units. I myself did too. You know, if you want to find out anything in a healthcare setting, spend time on the night shift unit. That's where it all comes out. We asked them, how frequently do you see and did you see employees expressing tenderness, caring, compassion in the organizational unit when you were there? Each trained rater averaged about 8 visits to the unit during our measurement time. We also measured, do the raters agree themselves? They did. That's about the extent of the statistics. I do have some backup data for anyone who's kind of a data person later. What we looked at in terms of does it matter was broad-ranging and spanned the attitudinal and behavioral domains of both employees and patients. We looked at, on the employee side, teamwork, compassion, emotion exhaustion, absenteeism. On the patient side, we looked at satisfaction, quality of life, mood. And I want a slight point here. About 80% of our patients were actually nonverbal due to Alzheimer's and other diseases, so we weren't always able to ask them, so we instead asked their primary caretakers for measures of mood. We also looked at health in terms of objective measures, got to be a little bit of a doctor in the MD sense here. And we finally looked at patient-family outcomes, satisfaction, and willingness to recommend the facility to others. I want to note an important aspect here about this emotional exhaustion finding. Sometimes it's also called burnout. And one of the most interesting and I think counterintuitive findings is that the literature, for the most part, talks about a phrase called service with a smile. And implied in this is a somewhat cynical perspective on the toll of putting on a smile and expressing positive emotions in the organization. What we find that you'll see is actually a complete reversal of this, that we think comes directly out of compassion when it's embodied in the organization's culture, not when it's a dictate that comes from management that says, look, when you're in front of the employees, you need to put on a smile, I don't care what you're feeling. What we find is that when you are actually deeply feeling, because you're in one of these organizations, the findings actually reverse. As you can see from our picture here, we looked at the whole spectrum. Another thing that we got, partly on the anthropological side, is a very rich qualitative picture of what this variation looks like. And it's important to look at variation because you want to say, hey, why does it matter? To say why it matters, you need to look at why it varies. I'd like to add that this organization has been a home for the patients. It's also been a home for me. My coworkers have been like family. So again, challenging the first assumption, these relationships are deep. They're very deep, in fact, like family. People genuinely care about the losses of patients, which is unfortunately quite common. I love them all. Now, don't we all want to be saying this? Think back to your organizational culture. Can you say, I love them all? That's what we want you to be, because as we'll suggest, that's really helpful. In terms of weak, we saw a lot of examples, and when you ask employees sometimes, there's an outpouring of this. What do weak cultures look like? People need to have a caring, loving spirit. They don't. A small minority is empathetic. They should be encouraged. Some staff members described as the opposite of caring. And just to note, this came out spontaneously when we just asked anything else you want to talk about. What did we find? Culture of companionate love positively impacts not only employees, but also the patients in terms of quality of life and actually hard outcomes such as transfers to the emergency room. It also reverses the finding that we find about emotional exhaustion. It leads to less burnout. Being in an emotional culture of companionate love leads employees to less burnout. Why is it important for the business leaders in the room? A lot of the emotions are driven most significantly from the leaders, enacting these emotions themselves and ideally actually feeling themselves. And it turns out, some initial research shows there's a benefit for leaders who engage in this sort of coaching and actually helps them feel the emotions themselves. So coaching employees to feel these emotions, to express them toward one another, actually helps you feel it yourself. So again, some organizations, particularly in Silicon Valley, interestingly, Cisco has a wonderful policy of requiring notification of the CEO within 48 hours of an employee's or employee close member death. It's a practice and policy that's embedded in the organization as one way of spreading this culture of companionate love, not just from employee to employee or leader to employee, but actually in the organizational structures and policies. Thank you all for your wonderful attention and hope to chat with you later.
We're running a little behind, but we'll take a few questions from the audience if you have some. So we have some mics set up here in the aisles. And we'll start with one question that's come up. Does the compassionate approach in an organization work counter to the carrot and stick or incentive and punishment kind of approach, or can they coexist? What's the ideal balance between the two?
Well, I think most of our research would suggest that the carrot and stick approach is a little bit of an old-fashioned approach that comes out of, interestingly, a misinterpretation of some of the early management theories that say, to get your employees to behave, you do this, you punish them, you offer incentives. I think what it's suggesting is that actually you need to go deeper than that and focus on the culture, and that if you focus on the culture, you have less of a need for the carrot and stick approach, which again, is sort of a misinterpretation of very early management work that, unfortunately, we keep reproducing in our business school classes.
As a Wharton undergrad, Adam, thanks for making the trip. Listen, I wonder, with all of your research, how do you talk to banks and bankers to understand this as part of the underwriting process that goes on? So, whether it's Seagate talking to theirs, or, a healthcare provider getting a different form of credit based on these kinds of employee cultures. How does a banker not only nod appropriately, but change the interest rate?
I usually scribble messages on dollar bills and hand them out. No, I think, for me at least, one of the most interesting questions has been to ask people, why did they get into the financial services industry in the first place? And I've been struck by how many people behind closed doors, when no one else is listening, will say, I really wanted to create value and help people achieve financial security, and my organization may not be very supportive of that. And I think one of the really nice things about working with banks is that they tend to be really quantitatively oriented. And so there's a great opportunity to say, let's take some good evidence. One of the things I will often do is bring in a randomized controlled experiment and say, look, here's some evidence, for example, like Liz was talking about, that if you actually get to see the people that you're helping and understand the impact of your work, you will often work harder and longer and more creatively. And that will translate into greater productivity for the bank, but also oftentimes more meaning and happiness for the employees who work there. And I think that what's really interesting is when you start that conversation, you actually get agreement or consent on, okay, here's the design of the experiment. Do you think this is a fair test? And once they buy into the methods, it's very hard for them to object to the results. And I think that the more we lead with evidence, the more likely they are to be persuaded. Others?
Thank you. Do you have a question?
So I was curious about any research or evidence on the relationship between financial success and an emphasis on having good culture. In the long term, I guess you could say a company that's successful and has good culture, but there you don't know what caused what. But is there something in the short or medium term that ties in a company's financial performance to a focus on culture?
It's such a great question, and why it's very, very important in doing this research to do research that's similar to what Adam alluded to in the previous column, the previous comment, that actually looks at this from a scientific perspective that focuses on random assignment and on watching change over time. A lot of times when we just go in and do a big, massive survey and run some correlations, we can't see these effects, and we can't disentangle the fact that it is true that more profitable companies tend to have, quote-unquote, better cultures. They tend to have more money to take care of people around the world. So it is hard to do that. And one way that we try to get at it is a focus on organizational change. So if we actually do scientific research in organizations, how can we change cultures? How can we demonstrate change, which enables us to sort of eliminate that alternate explanation, which isn't actually untrue. It is the case that profitability helps give money to do good things.
I'm kind of struck by how everything that you've all said this morning points towards interest in others as a fundamentally organizing principle for human relationships. And I'm just kind of struck by, I went to Stanford 30 years ago and took economics, and it was all about self-interest, and how this is really kind of pointing towards this other interest as being fundamental. And I'm just wondering if that's come about because we've kind of moved from a view of scarcity, where things were all scarce, where we actually have enough. And now our problem is not distributing things in an era of scarcity, it's distributing things in an era of abundance. Is that has that occurred to you guys?
So I think it's a great insight. I think what you're saying is really capturing a broad movement away from this sort of focus on self-interest to consideration of other interests. From my research, I think that that move does not depend on scarcity being replaced by plenty, because we can detect these same kinds of effects, even in staggeringly poor areas of the world. So I think that it's a more deep-seated aspect of humanity that we were maybe missing or getting misled by a little bit by some earlier thinking.
One quick addition on that is just say, I think one of the things we need to do is separate self-interest and concern for others and not treat them as opposite ends of the same continuum. Study after study after study shows that they're totally independent. And I think Bill Gates actually put it best at the World Economic Forum when he said, there are two great forces of human nature, self-interest and caring for others. And that the future of the economy really depends on the hybrid engine of the two, right? Aligning concern for ourselves with our interests in others as opposed to saying it's going to be one or the other. And I would love to see more work on the integration of those two motives.
Thank you very much to our panel.
Thank you. That was really a wonderful presentations and discussions.